Hi there, everyone, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, and thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling. It is March 1st, you guys, Monday. There are just 19 days until the first day of spring. Well, today on the show, we're going to be celebrating the first woman to describe fungi using the Linnaean system of classification. We'll also learn about a little-known prolific nature and floral writer from the 1800s. We'll hear a little recollection by a garden writer who received an armload of forsythia from a friend named Alice, and she got this lovely gift just when she needed it most. Then we also grow that garden library today with a book that encourages you to garden confidently, putting anxieties and fear behind you and creating the space of your dreams. And then we'll wrap things up with The Roots of Roses. They're deeper than you think. But first, I thought I'd take just a second to talk about what looks to be happening here in March, especially if you're in the Midwest and probably in other parts of the country. It looks like March is coming in like a lamb. And in fact, up here in Minnesota, they're saying that all of our snow could be gone by the middle of this week, which is just not the norm. And, for gardeners, that can be a wonderful thing. It's so wonderful to get a taste of spring and to, just really feel and savor the fact that we are going to be getting out into our gardens very soon. In fact, I know some of you will be tempted to get out there and start working in the yard and start working in the garden. And while, general cleanup isn't such a bad activity, I just want to remind you that things can change quickly. And sometimes new gardeners, well, for that matter, any gardener can get bit by the gardening bug and they can just throw caution to the wind and they can begin gardening prematurely before the conditions are truly ready and right for you to be in your garden. And I know just how hard it is to wait, but I also know how crushing it can be to anticipate an early spring only to see all of your efforts go down the drain when winter comes roaring back. So take your time, enjoy the wonderful weather, get outdoors, spend some time in nature. I'm always an advocate for that. Continue doing what you're already doing. If you're doing winter sowing, if you're seed starting, if you're planning a redesign, if you're reaching out to contractors or landscapers to get help in your garden, whatever it is, those behind the scenes efforts will pay off and you will get to act on them soon enough. But sad to say, it's still too early, especially in the Midwest, to get too serious about any outdoor gardening. So hold your horses. All right, it's time for Curated News. Today's Curated News is coming to us from Tree Hugger. This was a post that was written by Megan Holmes, and she rounded up 30 unique plants that attract butterflies. Well, I loved Megan's list for a couple of different reasons. Number one, of course, it's always wonderful to get a little refresh on the plants that attract pollinators. But even more so, I find that this is the time of year when it's time to brush up on that memory recall of plant names. And, we can get a little rusty. We get back in the garden and all of a sudden we can't remember the name of our favorite plant because it just disappeared during the winter. And so reading posts like this is great. It's like a little refresh. You roll through 30 different plants. You challenge yourself to remember the name of the plant. And what I especially love about Megan's post is she shares the common name and the botanical name. So this is a wonderful post to give yourself a little refresh on plant names and help pollinators too. So If you would like to read Megan's post, all you need to do is search for the number 30 in the Facebook group for the show, and then Megan's post will pop right up. And if you're not in the Facebook group for the show, don't worry about it. It is so easy to join. It's free, and you have a standing invitation at any time. All you need to do is search for the words Daily Gardener Community, where you'd search for a friend, and then request to join. I'd love to meet you in the group. It's time for Botanical History. Okay, hello. We are doing botanical history for this day, March 1st, and we're going to kick things off with March 1st, 1717. This is the birthday of the German artist, children's book author, and pioneering female botanist, Catherine Helena Dörrien. Catherine was born into an intellectual family in Hildesheim, a community southeast of Hanover. Her father, Rainier, believed that while beauty may not last, ignorance could be a lifelong affliction. And so back in the early 1700s, Rainier made sure that his daughter, Catharina, was educated. After the death of both her parents and her brother, Catharina sought work as a governess, and she found it nearly 200 miles away in the town of Dillenburg. Catharina worked for the Errett family. Anton was an attorney and a scholar, and Sophie was a childhood friend to Catharina. Now, Catharina got lucky. She could not have found a more like-minded household to her own family than the Erretts. Like Catharina's own parents, Anton and Sophie wanted both their sons and their daughters to be educated. As a teacher, Catharina turned to nature to teach about faith, science, morality, and life. Recognizing there were few resources for teaching women or children, Catharina wrote her own textbooks, which were heavily focused on botany and the natural world. It was rare enough that Catharina was teaching children and women about the natural world. It was nearly miraculous that Catharina could research and write her own horticultural guides. As the Errett children grew, Catharina was able to focus on her own botanical work. Now, Dillenburg was part of the Orange-Nassau Principality, and so Catharina gradually came to the idea of creating a flora for the area. She used her spare time to travel throughout the region, and she visited most of the areas at least twice so that she could capture plant life in different seasons. During the winter months, Catharina dedicated her focus on the smallest plants, lichen, mosses, and fungi. And finally, in 1977, Catharina published her 496-page flora, which used the Linnaean system to organize and name each specimen. Catharina's flora was remarkable for the 1700s, but also for the sheer fact that it was the work of a woman. During her fieldwork, Catharina created over 1,400 illustrations of local flora and fauna. Yet these masterpieces were not part of her flora. Instead, Catharina's botanical art became an heirloom that was passed down through the generations of the Errett family. And in 1875, a few pieces of Catharina's work were shown at an exhibition. However, 15 years later, a large collection of paintings by a man named Johann Philipp Sandberger was bought by the Museum of Wiesbaden. Johann was a dear friend of Anton Eretz, and today his work is considered to be copies of Catharina's original watercolor masterpieces. And yet we owe a debt of gratitude to Johann because somehow Catharina's work was lost to time. The curator Friedrich von Heinbeck once said that the precision of Catharina's brushstrokes was like that of an embroiderer who stitched with only the finest thread. Now, in terms of botanical history, it's interesting to note that Catharina was following in the 50-year-old footsteps of botanical artists like Maria Sibylla Merian and Elizabeth Blackwell. But Catharina managed to distinguish herself not only by her exquisite botanical art, but by her botanical work and in the naming of those two plants, those two little lichens that she named after herself, Major Dörrieni and Minor Dörrieni. And here's some good news. Over the past 3 decades, Catharina's life story has been rediscovered. Regina Viereck wrote a biography of Catharina called They Are the Hands of a Woman. The botanist and educator, Catharina Helena Dörrien. And in 2018, Catharina's story became the subject of an elaborate musical by Ingrid Ketz, and it debuted in her adopted hometown, Dillenburg. It was called Catharina Dörrien, A Life Between Love and War. And also on this day in botanical history is the birthday of the children's author, volunteer, poet, and teacher, Lenore Elizabeth Mullitz, who was born on this day, March 1st, 1877. Born Nora Mullitz in Kansas, Lenore's mother died when she was just 10 years old. Raised by her uncle's family, Lenore left for Chicago's Wheaton College to become a teacher. Now, in addition to teaching, Lenore was a marvelous children's author. Her titles included Stories of Birds, Flower Stories, Insect Stories, Tree Stories, and Stories of Trees, just to name a few. And her books were always charming and uplifting. For instance, in the preface to Flower Stories, Lenore wrote, "When the flowers of the field and garden lift their bright faces to you, can you call them by name and greet them as an old acquaintance? Or, having passed them 100 times, are they still strangers to you?" In this little book of flower stories, only our very familiar friends have been planted. About them have been woven our favorite poems, songs, and stories. And regarding seeds, Lenore once wrote this marvelous little verse. "A wonderful thing is a seed, the one thing deathless forever, forever old and forever new, utterly faithful and utterly true, fickle and faithless never. Plant lilies and lilies will bloom, plant roses and roses will grow, plant hate and hate to life will spring, plant love and love to you will bring, the fruit of the seed you sow." And long before Twitter, in her book Stories of Birds, Lenore wrote, "Such a twittering and fluttering there was when this news came." It's time for Unearthed Words. Today's unearthed words come from the British American gardener, writer, TV presenter, and a woman who was known as the Julia Child of horticulture, Thalassa Crusoe. This is from her book, To Everything There Is a Season. It's from a little chapter called Alice and Forsythia. And I just want to say, before I read this, just to tee it up for you, that Thalassa was born in England, but then came to America. And so when she wrote this, she was referencing that time of her life when she had just come to the United States. My first winter in this country was long and bitterly cold, and I was desperate for spring, which I then was used to seeing appear far earlier. One day, a new friend brought me an armful of forsythia branches still covered with half-melted snow. Sensing my homesickness, she had denuded one of her bushes for me. I had nowhere cold and bright in the apartment in which we were living, so that forsythia had to be put in a hot, unlighted hall. But this particular present came to me late in the season and at a time when forsythia will flower, even when forced under intolerable conditions. And when, at last in this strange country, something came to life through my efforts, I began to feel that here was truly home. Now, each year, as the forsythia flowers again for me indoors, I remember that incident as the turning point in my feelings about this country. And I recall with deep affection the sensitivity of that friend. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Fearless Gardening by Laurie Bowle. This book came out in 2021, and the subtitle is Be Bold, Break the Rules, and Grow What You Love. In this book, the woman behind the website, The Danger Garden, teaches us how to live on the edge and in the beds of our gardens without fear or anxiety. Laurie lives to inspire people to look at plants differently and to see their gardens through new eyes, to treat gardening as an adventure, to embrace the freedom to explore a new type of plant, and then to plant it just because you want to. The roots of horticulture and academia have provided a framework of do's and don'ts, cloaked within a fortress of botanical nomenclature and complex terminology. It's no wonder gardeners feel anxious. As Laurie says, why not surround yourself with the plants you love? Who cares if they're not supposed to be planted together, might eventually crowd each other, or aren't everyone's cup of tea? It's your garden, and you should love it. You should be having fun. Remember, there's always room for one more plant. Well, I think we can all agree with that. This book is 256 pages of gardening without a rule book or guilt or all the shoulds and oughtas, from a woman who made her garden her own way through courageous experimentation, zone pushing, an artistic eye, and an adventurous spirit. You can get a copy of Fearless Gardening by Laurie Bowle and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $18. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. It was on this day, March 1st in 1979, that the call leader out of Elwood, Indiana, published an article called "The Roots of Roses Go Back Many Years." I thought this little article was a total delight. Just keep remembering that this was written back in 1979. If you were to trace the ancestry of today's rose, you'd have enough bagots to fill a book, or maybe two. In fact, a fossilized rose found at Crooked River, Oregon, some years ago, established that this particular species grew on our continent 35 million years ago. And some paleobotanists believe that the rose actually dates back to the Cretaceous age 70 million years ago. Well, this would make the rose older than any known civilization. 1979 has been designated the year of the rose, and perhaps a little rose history is in order, says John Watt, Purdue University extension horticulturist. Briefly, all our roses came from species. Cross species gave us a new hybrid type of rose, and crossing of types provided another new type. In the late 1700s, botanists discovered ever-blooming roses growing in the gardens of the subtropics in China. Because of their tea-like fragrance, they became known as tea roses. Now, here are some interesting facts about roses. Did you know that no rose species are native to any land areas south of the equator? Or did you know that the name rose appears in no fewer than 4,000 published songs? Did you know that the rose is the official state flower of New York, Iowa, Georgia, and North Dakota? And in all polls ever taken to determine the most popular flower, the overwhelming favorite is the rose. And finally, we owe much to Empress Josephine of France for our modern-day roses. It was Josephine who assembled the leading hybridizers of her time and sponsored their experiments to develop new strains and varieties. So, if you're a rose lover, and you can remember to do so tonight, give a little toast to Empress Josephine. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener, and remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. Hey, thanks for spending part of your day with The Daily Gardener. If you want to read even more botanical brevities, just head on over to thedailygardener.org. That's where you can find all the stories, biographies, and books that I share on the show. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. It has lots of goodies in it, and I try to make the newsletter like you're getting a marvelous letter from a garden friend. You can always find The Daily Gardener on all your favorite social media. You can follow the show on Twitter, and you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook and request to join. Last but not least, you can easily share your gardener greetings or book submissions by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Maple Grove in Wyoming, Minnesota, with the help of Paige Mance, Brooke Bierbaum, and Eric Begay. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.